So this is the first part of the Khoodeelaar campaign, World Exclusive Diagnosis of Fleet Street. Part 1 of the Khoodeelaar campaign, World Exclusive Diagnosis of Fleet Street, of today, Friday, the 18th of December 2020. This is unlike any other broadcast that is known, at least as far as we are concerned. We don't know of any other program that deals with the contents, the role, and the behavior of the London-based, London-centric newspapers that appear on, let's say, 5 days a week, 10 titles currently. The Financial Times, recently it has started calling itself the FT, the Guardian, the Times, the Borisgraph, also known as the Telegraph, but we have given it the name Borisgraph because of its particular role in buying the loyalty of and using Boris Johnson for the promotion of the agenda and the narrative that the Borisgraph actually benefits from, or the owners of the Borisgraph benefit from. The Daily Mirror and the Daily Beaverbrook, also known as the Daily Express, and the Daily Star. These three are published by the same corporate owners, but these three follow slightly different kind of surfaces or facades. Essentially, they are the same political narrative, but they don't kind of own up to it. They maintain the pretension to their readers, so-called, that they are loyal to those readers' particular prejudices. And it is the prejudices because most of the readers of the Fleet Street papers are, in our language, the gullibles. And the gullibles are the ones that actually voted for the Brexit. That is a current example. And they are mainly drawn from what is collectively, accurately described as the indigenous, mainly white population. And then the Daily Mail, Rupert Murdoch's Daily Mail, and the Scum, also owned by the Murdoch, and the I newspaper. So these are the 10 titles that appear 5 days. And on 6 days, that is the Saturday, the Financial Times or the FT becomes the edition for Saturday and Sunday. And the I newspaper as well does the same. And there is the other so-called daily coming out of an address in London. In fact, it's an address in Tower Hamlets in East London. And it is called the Morning Star. We call it the Morning Star because of its congenital propensity to distort the basic truth. It's supposed to be the socialist daily. It is supposed to be the world's only English language socialist daily. And that is the evidence on which we base our description of it and calling it the Daily Scar, because it is a scar on the truth, on basic facts. So anyone watching this for the first time must note these facts, and also the fact that our campaign, which is called Khoodeelaar, which is the kind of Siloti language word that I devised, and it was initially created as a call for action to defend the comparatively small in terms of the wider kind of demography, the small community in the east end of London, that is mainly a community made up of people from Bangladesh and essentially from Silot, which is in English spelling Sylhet, but the phonetic original is Silot. So it can be spelled S-double-E, like see, sight, see, lot, L-O-T, see everything, see the lot. So that's the thing to remember, Silot. And I have been campaigning for the defense of the community, both as a physical kind of action, as well as a symbolic representative action in terms of principle and in terms of the ethics and morality. And the attack on this community that prompted the coinage of this word, Khoodeelaar, was being done by the crossrail fronted agenda of big business and other criminal forces in control of the key decisions in the UK. And the news this week, or this day, today, this week, that is not included in the contents of the Khoodeelaar or contents of the Khoodeelaar diagnosed Fleet Street newspapers includes two items. One is the fact that the current UK post holder in the UK post of Chancellor, that is the Finance Minister, Rishi Sunak, has been hiding the truth about his conflict of interest, let's say, in terms of finance. And this has been detailed in a report in the fortnightly issue of Private Eye, which is dated today, a fortnight starting from today. And we shall talk more about Rishi Sunak in a little while in this edition. And the other item is the item about Dominic Cummings. Now, Cummings is the one that has apparently finished his contract of employment as Boris Johnson's main advisor today, after he was either sacked or he resigned or he was forced to resign a few weeks ago. Now, Cummings still is in the news because of the allegation that Boris Johnson, despite the kind of differences of opinion or whatever between them, actually abused his position and gave Cummings too much kind of bonus or too much of a rise in his salary. Now, this salary overpayment or overuse of the funds to kind of benefit and reward chums and close people close to the regime fronter, Boris Johnson, is also kind of contextually relevant because in the so-called industry outlet called the UK Press Gazette, which is now known as pressgazette.co.uk, has this week run a story about Lionel Barber. Now, Lionel Barber, according to the reports, was for 14 years or 15 years involved as the main editorial executive at the Financial Times and the National Union of Journalists, which is hardly in the news for reasons of politics or ethical reasons. I mean, it should be, but it isn't. Is in the news rarely this week because it has broken off talks about pay with the Financial Times management. The Financial Times apparently employs 700 journalists and a few hundred others in non-journalistic kind of positions. And the claim is that the FT is now probably the world's sixth largest kind of news outlet that has got the highest number of digital subscribers. This is something that we shall not be discussing at length about, because it's mainly a marketeering kind of claim. And the reason why we will be discussing Lionel Barber is because he has been given close to about £3 million of benefits. And his benefits, Dominic Cummings's pay rise, and the other item that we have discussed and we shall be discussing more of is the actual evidence of misconduct or dishonesty by Rishi Sunak, who for several years now, since he became an MP, according to the report or analysis in the Private Eye dated today, has hidden his financial kind of relationships. Now, Rishi Sunak is being repeatedly referred to as the son-in-law of a man in India who spells his name as Murthy, M-U-R-T-H-Y, Murthy, while his daughter, married to Sunak, has dropped the H from the spelling of the name. So it's Marty, it's like anglicized. But despite the one letter difference between the spelling of the daughter's company and the father, the relationship that the Private Eye piece is actually pointing to is about the £5 billion worth of the company called Infosys. Infosys is a digital kind of operation, digital company or digital services company founded by Rishi Sunak's father-in-law, Murthy. And now the money that Rishi Sunak is being cited about is the money and the financial interest and the stake that Sunak has transferred to his wife, who is called Akshana, Okkota, or I mean, the spelling it's a Sanskrit-based name, and it's indestructible or unhurt or unharmed or unharmable. Murthy, M-U-R-T-Y, Murthy, is that she has been used as a kind of decoy to hide Rishi Sunak's actual stake in big financial interests. So the Private Eye piece is saying that Rishi Sunak has been hiding information about his significant financial interests, and they're calling it a conflict of interest, and they're saying that it has got serious implications. What they're suggesting, they're not expressly saying it as I'm saying it, but they are suggesting that he's abusing not only that connection, the connection with his wife and her financial stakes and her role, and the fact that her father is the main person who's founded the Infosys outfit in India. They're saying that Rishi Sunak has been capable of or susceptible to being accused of having abused the UK financial kind of or fiscal system which he controls, which is worth £2 trillion at the current time, or which has got liabilities or assets or debts or worth or whatever obligations around £2 billion, and that billions of pounds, hundreds of billions of pounds have been deployed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And that has been done by him. And Sunak has been the finance minister since January this year, 2020. And the pandemic was recognized as having hit the UK in February, or starting in February, starting shortly after, let's say, Rishi Sunak became Boris Johnson's finance minister. Now, Rishi Sunak, Lionel Barber, and Dominic Cummings. Barber is not directly connected with Boris Johnson as such, but the principle is the same, because the Financial Times has been losing money or losing profit as a kind of capitalist enterprise, and its income has gone down significantly, very significantly. So that is one of the areas of concern about the fact that the Financial Times management decided to reward Lionel Barber when the paper was doing so badly, or the business of the newspaper Financial Times was doing so badly. Now, this is a pattern about this country or this economy. And the pattern is, the so-called left or the socialists. By the way, I'm not a socialist and I'm not a capitalist. I am independent of both. And that is the difference that anyone watching this must note. I'm not in either camp, and I'm not in any center or anything. I'm universally, objectively basing any observation, any assertion on the evidence, which is regardless of the party political or ideological affiliations of anyone involved in anything that I'm kind of analyzing and diagnosing. And the whole idea of the investigation into the conduct and the role of the Fleet Street papers is to take away the ideological baggages and isolate the actual evidence from the baggaged kind of attention. Now, neither of the kind of mainstream versions, the broadcast or the print media, is talking about this corruption, which is what Lionel Barber has been actually involved in, despite the fact that he's been saving the Financial Times from sinking over the 14 years. And my take on that is that he's a liar. Now, as I said, when I use the word liar, I don't say that as an abuse. I say that as an evidence-based statement and characterization. So it's not like intended by malice on my part. No, it is intended to express in the most truthful way the role of the person, the character of the person. And the fact that Barber has been now exposed as having kind of grabbed hold of nearly £2 million of the Financial Times, while the journalists, 700 journalists, none of them has been given that kind of money. Well, they cannot have been, but it has to be pointed out that 700 journalists, and we'll talk about the number of the 700 journalists and what role they play and what actually the content and the quality they contribute to, the quality of information that readers and users of the Financial Times deserve, I mean, objectively speaking. I mean, I'm leaving out the big conglomerates that use the Financial Times to enhance their agenda. I'm talking about ordinary people who pick up the paper or subscribe to the paper digitally as they're boasting increasingly. What do they gain in terms of the truth? And I have been pointing this out that the Financial Times is not telling the truth. If it had been telling the truth, then Lionel Barber would never have been able to get that kind of loot. He would not have been able to rob the sinking kind of funds at the expense of the journalists. And the journalists, I'll be discussing the actual role of the journalists as well, because if the journalists at the Financial Times around the world, not just based in London, but they are based all around the world according to the Financial Times, not every single country, but they are strategically based in terms of the Financial Times' strategies. If they were doing their job of morally and ethically and truthfully reporting on the financial state of the country and society and the economy, and multiply that and say the economies and the countries that they cover, the Financial Times supposedly covers, then somebody like Lionel Barber, who has been a self-seeker and self-promoter for a very long time at the Financial Times, and I'm saying this not based on the disclosures in the UK Press Gazette today or this week, but I'm talking about observations of the FT and Lionel Barber, because he has had a lot of platforms given to him by mysteriously kind of connected sources. Places he has been addressing have nothing to do with journalism, nothing to do with financial journalistic ethics or morality. And yet he has been championing and been championed as a kind of expert on all kinds of things, which is absolutely not true. The only reason why he has been given those platforms and the only reason he has accepted those platforms is because he has been hired, he has been kind of bribed, and he has abused his position as the editor and the kind of leading post holder at the Financial Times for as long as he has done. Because he has then been able to return the favors. Of course, he will not say in a piece that he would have promoted that he has been influenced by his connections with those interests that have bribed him. Point I'm making here about Barber is that Fleet Street is a vehicle for corruption and crooks. And that is the essence of our diagnosis. Of course, the diagnosis is more detailed than just that one word, corrupt. Fleet Street is corrupt, but that is the center of the operation of Fleet Street. The other thing which has come from, incidentally, it's very ironic that comes from an interview or a public statement that Dominic Cummings has reportedly given this week, and has been kind of reported. His comments have been reported as being as a veiled criticism of Boris Johnson and Boris Johnson's fiancée, Carrie Simons. And what the headline doesn't say, but what the copy about that interview or statement says, is that the nuclear proliferation and chemical war proliferation is going ahead very fast. So what Cummings is saying in that particular reported statement is that while the world is getting unsafer by the minute because of the threat of nuclear chemical warfare, some people are indulging in, and the papers are indulging them in running stories about their dogs. Now, that is a reference to Kerry Simmons's dog, because the references to Simmons and Johnson also include the fact that in their Christmas card or some kind of ceremonial card that Johnson has sent out to people as the post holder of the kind of post of prime minister that he is, they haven't used the picture of their newly born son. In fact, they have used the picture of their dog, Kerry Simmons's dog. So Cummings is reportedly saying that they're doing this while the world is getting more dangerous. Now, that is a perfectly valid comparison, contextual comparison. And we shall spare kind of Cummings the ignominy of being condemned for all the wrong things he has done for Johnson, because he is now pointing out one point about the safety of the world, the planet, and that is worth kind of taking a break from heaping any condemnation on him, or on this occasion, about this item at least. So all these 4 items that we have now discussed so far are not included in the Fleet Street Papers, because the revelation about Lionel Barber's looting of the Financial Times doesn't come from the daily newspapers. It comes from the UK Press Gazette or the pressgazette.co.uk website. And yet, Fleet Street should be talking about that. And which is where we come back to talking about the journalists and the NUJ, the National Union of Journalists. What use is the National Union of Journalists if its members refrain from reporting the truth and seeking the truth about what is going on in Fleet Street or in the world? Why would they, members of the NUJ, refrain from publishing the truth about the safety of the whole planet that is threatened by a fast speeding proliferation of nuclear warfare and biological and chemical warfare kind of weapons? That shows that the NUJ's members are liars. And that is actually the case. For decades, since the, let's say, foundation of the United Nations, the NUJ members have been working for warmongering owners, racist owners that have been violating all the charters and agreements and conventions and treaties that the United Nations actually spawned, and which the UK has been a signatory to. And the same thing happened with the 2016 Brexit. If the Financial Times has got 700 journalists, then the Daily Mail would have similar number of journalists. The Times would have, if not that many, but at least few hundred journalists. So altogether, let's say on average, the 10 titles that we have mentioned currently constitute the Fleet Street for 5 days at least. They've got, say, 500 journalists apiece. So that is 500 multiplied by 10, 5,000. 5,000 journalists. And none of them did the investigation against the liars that lied for Brexit. And over the last 75 years, the NUJ's members have not done their job. Because increasingly, all the legal obligations and constitutional obligations and ethical obligations, moral obligations that the owners of these papers are under, they have been broken, and they have been defied, and they have been defied and broken with the collusion and the complicity of active members of the NUJ working in those titles. Now, that is only about London. Extrapolate the number, and the NUJ members are spread right across the UK. So thousands of members of the NUJ have been colluding with the peddling of the lies by the British newspapers. Lies about very serious issues that affect the very lives of human beings. And they have not done. Let's take another contrasting example. There is a woman called Sue Reid. S-U-E Sue, Reid, R-E-I-D, Sue Reid, who is the kind of, how to describe her? Sue Reid is the screamer, the racist screamer. She screams racist, kind of hatred and scaremongers. But she doesn't do it like Carol Moron, who is another racist, or Don Neeson, who is another racist on the Daily Star, Neeson. But Carol Moron and Don Neeson do the populist kind of immediate scream. But Sue Reid does the longer kind of version. For example, unlike Don Neeson or Carol Moron, Sue Reid specializes in traveling abroad and posing as the kind of hands-on investigative reporter, digging up the truth about the horrors and the threat posed to Little England by all these migrants. So she goes to the Calais migrants center when it was allowed by the racists in France to stay open. She goes to Calais, she goes to other places, like she goes to borders of Syria, she goes to other places, and she comes back, and she goes to, of course, Dover, and directly reports from the threat posed by the migrants, most of whom get drowned in trying to cross the waters from France to England. Now, these people do this one-sided thing, pro-racist, and all of these kind of journalism against the code of conduct that the NUJ claims to be kind of adhering to. But that's a lie. So the NUJ is dysfunctional, as are its members when it comes to the aims and objects. And when it comes to the aims and objects that should be kind of emboldened in doing the right thing by the presence, by the existence of the active membership by the UK of these declarations and charters and conventions and agreements. But the NUJ doesn't supervise them, doesn't hold them to account, neither centrally nor in the so-called branch level. The branch of the NUJ on a newspaper or news organization gives the game away. It's called the chapel, like a chapel of the church. So what it is a pretentious continuation of the origin of the formation of the NUJ and the influence, the Christian church's influence in the organization. Now, of course, the NUJ itself would not agree that it is a continuation of the church and at the expense of other religions and against who it is discriminating. That is what the NUJ would say. They say that they are not discriminating against any other religions other than Christianity either. But the name, the chapel, gives the game away, as I said. And it is a completely church-like, submissive, servile kind of operation. All the branches of the NUJ, in all the newspaper of organizations where their members or the journalistic staff include members of the NUJ. There are other outfits that are anti-NUJ and anti-trade union, but they are a diversion created by the employer organization or employers of each organization. The employers discourage the activities of the NUJ because they say that the NUJ actually distract from the work. And the NUJ has been a failure. The NUJ has been a failure because just like the Labour Party, the founding aims of the Labour Party are completely trampled on. That is, they walk all over the founding aims and objects of the Labour Party. The Labour Party MPs, the Labour Party leader, currently Keir Starmer. They walk all over the founding aims and objects of the Labour Party. So the NUJ's members really have nothing but contempt for the moral and ethical aims and purposes and the obligations that they should be adhering to. And as I said, when I was an active attender of NUJ meetings as a member of the NUJ, I observed to my utter internal disgust because I couldn't share my disgust with anybody else because all the others present alongside with me were quite happy with the disgusting stupidity that was going on. And the meetings were taking place in a pub. I didn't drink, I don't drink, but that is where the venue was. So it gives the game away again. Because if they had a meeting in a pub, then the reason why they chose a pub as a venue was because it was proximity to the drinks. So they were really dependent on the kind of supply of drinks, alcohol, through their veins that kept them going at the meeting. No way could that be a real, serious moral or ethical engagement, and it wasn't. So after a few years of attending this complete stupidity and diversion, I stopped attending these meetings. But I did collect first-hand experience of how deranged and how degenerate the trade union meetings, so-called, of the NUJ were. And I have other experiences of the NUJ and other unions, and I can confirm that the fact that the conservatives ideologically have been able to gain control of the government in this country and hold on to the control, no matter how bad they are, is very centrally connected with the fact that there is no left, there is no union, and there is no description of socialism in this country whatsoever. And I refer again to the World Socialist website that published in February 2018 an item, roughly speaking, headlined that the labor councils are in bed with developers, that is, property speculators, people who take away the housing rights from people. And that was 2018. It was very much the time when Corbyn was very much in the post of leader of the Labour Party. Corbyn did not reply to that allegation, nor did anybody else from the Labour Party, nor from the councils that were named, or the former councillors a number of whom became MPs by the time that article appeared, none of them contested the assertion. And they couldn't, because the assertions were factual, fact-based. So there is no investigation into the calamity. There is no investigation into the calamity that the Boris Johnson-fronted government has been, either on the handling of the pandemic or on Brexit. Can you imagine? There has been no investigation. There has been no investigation by Fleet Street into the brutal abuse of the police against the trade unionists that supported the workers' action against the attack on the mine workers in the mid-1980s. I mean, Margaret Thatcher was into her 6th year since she got in, after James the racist Callaghan made it absolutely possible for her to gain control at the election, 1979 election. So there has been no investigation by Fleet Street into the abuse of the police force by Margaret Thatcher, the abuse of these state agencies into spying and sabotaging the lives of spying on and sabotaging the work and life and livelihoods of the people who opposed the attack on the mine workers. And Margaret Thatcher destroyed the mine workers. Now, technically, environmentally, there is a debate to be had about the suitability or acceptability of mines and coals and whatever. That is an environmental issue. What is involved in the behavior of the NUJ and the journalists and newspaper on the Fleet Street in suppressing the truth about the attacks on the civil liberties of the trade unionists and the campaigners, the strikers. That's what we are focusing on here. And the focus is part of the wider focus on the fact that the Fleet Street papers don't tell the British public anything about the truth of what the government is doing. And that truth is Fleet Street's collusion in keeping quiet about the fast kind of expansion of nuclear warfare weapons and chemical warfare weapons, which is what Dominic Cummings has mentioned reportedly this week. So when the British newspapers and the British kind of parliament and the British government and ministers in opposition refer to the world, they do that reluctantly because, as I said, our theme, based on the evidence, is that the British papers, the Fleet Street, don't recognize the existence of the world outside of Little England and Little Ireland of England. They only do this when the need for that petty, narrow reasons to refer to the rest of the world. So for 500 years, they actually occupied other people's worlds, other people's countries in Africa and Asia, and far away in Australia and other places. So the mindset that has been developed over the main years of occupation and empire and imperialism and robbery and looting and plunder, that mindset has been perpetuated. It is perpetuated today, Friday, the 18th of December 2020, because the Fleet Street papers are devoid of any reference to the things that I have been talking about. Rishi Sunak, conflict of interest, serious financial kind of abuse of the financial information that he owes a duty to provide to the public He has been intentionally, deliberately, and knowingly withholding that information from the British public. And Dominic Cummings saying that the Fleet Street papers of the media would prefer to indulge in Boris Johnson and Kerry Simmons's indulgence in pathetically promoting the state of health or activities of that dog rather than talk about the threat to the world posed by the high proliferation, that is the speedy expansion in the nuclear and chemical warfare and biological warfare. Weapons, biological, chemical, and nuclear war weapons. And there is no mention of this in the floor of the House of Commons either. And Cummings could include the members of parliament, members of the government. And Fleet Street is not alone. Fleet Street remains in league with France, Germany, and other Western European kind of counterparts of the so-called daily newspapers or the daily media, which are keeping quiet and silent about the proliferation of biological, chemical, and nuclear war weapons. So the kind of diversion from that significant, very serious kind of prospect, ironically, is a diversion that has been engineered by Cummings along with Johnson by Brexit. Because in all of the vote Leave and Brexit kind of propaganda, Cummings never mentioned the threat to the world. Cummings never mentioned the threat to the very existence of the planet posed by these already existing chemical, biological, nuclear weaponry. So he may say that, but he too can be found to have been complicit in the diversion from focusing attention on the very threat that humanity faces, not just Britain, not just little England, but the whole of humankind, humanity. And of course, the question of Cummings's pay, high pay, and Lionel Barber's high pay, these are not discussed by Fleet Street, most certainly not. The UK Press Gazette is not part of Fleet Street. It's an outlet that does the business by reporting on the kind of internal business activities of the Fleet Street papers and others. So the Press Gazette is not an investigative platform, despite the fact that we are putting the context and putting it together and making it look relevant to our investigative, analytical, diagnostic presentation. What we are saying is not available anywhere. So this is what makes it unique, literally, exclusive, world exclusive, literally, not because we like the phrase world exclusive, but because this is the fact. This is factually the case. And in the columns of the Guardian and the Daily Mirror, because these are the two that appear to be not conservative or claim to be not conservative, but even they are not publishing anything that really remotely resembles investigative reporting on issues that seriously threaten the very existence of society, humanity. The Daily Mirror has got a claim this week that it has been campaigning for 30 years for the British government to recognize sacrifices made by the people who took part in the nuclear test, British nuclear tests that were carried out on the Christmas Islands, which are situated somewhere between Indonesia and Australia, I think, but which are occupied, abused by the British as part of the imperialist kind of behavior. Now, recently, although the Daily Mirror has claimed that it has been campaigning for the recognition of those people's sacrifices for 30 years, the participation by its one of their columnists called Susie Boniface, who goes by the name of Fleet Street Fox, she has only recently joined the Daily Mirror, and she has only recently started to write the piece or the dedicated pieces about the kind of need to recognize those veterans. And she's her age is kind of insufficiently long to have allowed her to become a journalist 30 years ago. She has not been a journalist for 30 years. If she has been, then she has been a junior one for 30 years. Whatever it is, she has only started recently. Now, the point I'm making by referring to her is that because she is the dedicated one that the Mirror has allowed to write on this particular call by the Mirror for the recognition of the veterans of the nuclear test. What we have pointed out to Susie or Fleet Street Fox is this, that the reason why the British government doesn't recognize veterans like these ones is connected with the fact that the government doesn't recognize most people who do most of the work in society, for society, and for the country. The British government doesn't recognize the sacrifices and the role of the many in every respect, in every aspect of society. And that the fact that the Daily Mirror is making a big issue in its own words of about the sacrifices of these veterans shows up the Daily Mirror's own ignorance and racism and stupidity and the role that the Daily Mirror plays. It's not questioning everything that the state does that is wrong. It's not opposing racism, and it's not opposing empire and imperialism. Now, without doing all those things, opposing racism, condemning empire and imperialism, you cannot explain why the British government doesn't recognize the sacrifices of these veterans, because the veterans are being chosen for recommendation by the Daily Mirror's campaign, because they're almost all of them, so far as they have published. They may include people from other backgrounds. I mean, the Christmas Island people may not be all white. They may be African people or people of, or the original nations, like the original people in Australia, in Canada, North America, and other backgrounds. But until they expressly admit that, the assumption is, and we make that assumption, that the Daily Mirror is only overly keen about patriotic duties done by these people because they are supposed to be all white. And the Daily Mirror itself doesn't recognize the equal work done by people of African and Asian backgrounds in society or in the world of ideas in campaigning. The Daily Mirror remains a racist paper as the rest of the Fleet Street papers. Daily Mirror reflects the same racist collection of images that the broadcasting outlets where Susie Boniface appears as a guest. She appears on the BBC News channel, she appears on the Sky News channel, and she appears on Channel 5, where the Jeremy Vine, a multifariously overpaid kind of professional, presents a program which used to be hosted by somebody called Wright. So Jeremy Vine happens to be on the record as having been an admirer of Susie Boniface, because he reviewed her book and praised it significantly. So there may be a connection in terms of her feeling praised by him. So therefore she doesn't reject his ideological racism, which is where we are focused on. So Susie Boniface, if she were black, she wouldn't be getting the platforms that she does get. She wouldn't therefore be getting the recognition that she does get. And that is the reality of the absolute majority of people from African and Asian background, whether they're born in this country or not. And there is this racist kind of discrimination condoned by the Daily Mirror. So how can the Daily Mirror seriously expect to be treated as if it's doing a moral kind of case for the recognition of these people who sacrificed their health and died, many of them died prematurely, and whose kind of health were affected by the exposure to these nuclear tests, which in turn affected their children and their biological kind of lives. And so it is very central to every failure to serve society by any government. It is important to understand why that failure continues. And the reason why it continues is because the ruling cliques that for hundreds of years were allowed or able to abuse the countries where the empire operated got used to exploiting and abusing people, the local peoples, without any real resistance. And it is a fact. In the subcontinent of Pakistan and Bangladesh and India, they stayed for 190 years as the occupiers. They had been there for far longer, because the East India Company had been kind of on maneuvers for a very long time before they managed to bribe the locals fronted by Mir Zafar Ali Khan. But we date it from the June 1757 betrayal and treachery by Mir Zafar Ali Khan. And so June 1757 to 15th of August 1947, it's 190 years. And apart from the 1857 revolt that they sabotaged, there were not many organized actions by the people in the subcontinent to kick the imperialists out. So essentially, the imperialists in those places outside of the UK got used to being and able to carry on controlling the regimes without any resistance. And that's what they're doing here. And that's what they were doing for most of those centuries where they held kind of the countries under control of the empires, the British Empire. And there is no tradition in this country of the local people, the indigenous people, rising up against imperialism in solidarity with the people of Africa and Asia and other parts of the world that were under the occupation of the imperialists, the British imperialists. There were the uprisings like the uprising in Waterloo, in Manchester, and other local uprisings. But those uprisings were not connected. They were not connected with any demands for independence from the British Empire by the people in the country under occupation of the imperialists, British imperialists. So there has been this lack of solidarity. And this lack of solidarity has got worse now because there is no sign of the so-called socialists in this country even remembering that for 500 years various parts of the world were taken over and occupied by the British imperialists. And so therefore they don't see the connection between the British Empire and the people coming to this country from Africa and Asia, from areas that were colonized by the British. And in the narrative, in the discussions, Fleet Street never mentions the empire. What the Guardian does, sick-makingly, is what it has been doing now, is feature an individual black person. And almost in passing, not as a central fact, but as a fact in passing, they mention the fact that they come from former colonies or colonized parts of the world, colonized by the British. That's not what the main narrative should be. The narrative should be that Britain, economically and socially, has existed, has survived solely by exploiting the rest of the world. Now, what is beginning to happen with the Brexit lunacy is a reminder that is coming in terms of economic dependence by the British on the EU member countries, not to speak about the rest of the world. And so the Fleet Street is completely empty of this kind of narrative, the explanation that I'm giving here. The explanation which alone is justified by the facts. And what the opposition party, fronted by Keir Starmer, has chosen to do is to continue and perpetuate this denial of empire. And they treat empire as a kind of incidental thing. It's not the main thing. And look at the states of the economies over the centuries that they looted and plundered in Africa and Asia. You can see the repercussions, the continuing repercussions of imperialism and imperialist exploitation. So the Fleet Street papers are not running anything, any feature about any of that, ever. So the Fleet Street newspapers are full of absolute blanks in terms of substance. And as we say, the people who mainly kind of consume or buy these papers are the gullibles, the mentally brainwashed, majority indigenous white people who are not capable of understanding the evidence because they have not been given the evidence. They have been made kind of mentally superficial by the over display and over presentation and over dependence, literally, on the in the name of newspapers, in the name of journalism, they have been kind of made devoid of reading hard facts about society, about the world, including the threat to the very existence of the planet. And of course, they don't demand the answers to any questions about finance and abuse of the money by the government, by the MPs and ministers. So it's a very artificial kind of population in terms of intelligence, in terms of action, in terms of social awareness, which is why the government was caught unprepared to deal with the pandemic. And it remains unprepared because today's papers and today's coverage in Fleet Street about the various aspects and various approaches to dealing with the pandemic over the so-called Christmas are typical of the Fleet Street ignorance, because they are running about 5 different stories about the same thing, 5 contradictory, conflicting interpretations and views. That is what is happening in the Times, and that is what is happening in the Sun, the Scum, and the others. And the Guardian increasingly is becoming like the Daily Mail. And so what is happening to the public that buy these papers is that they are in ignorance and they are not getting the facts about the A to Z of the conduct of the virus. They're not getting the facts about the finance. They're not getting the facts about the impact and the implication of Brexit, because increasingly it is looking like many of the things that the British economy, British consumers, public have got used to over the last 50 years, let's say, of being a member of the common market or the economic bloc. Those things come from Europe, and they will be increasingly difficult to get hold of. That's what the majority of the business communities are saying and expressing concerns about. We haven't talked about the newspapers, the Fleet Street so-called coverage or the cover-up. Coverage is when newspapers actually mention something, report on something, and cover-up is when they don't do that. So they hide something. And there can be 2 parallel lists of the ones that they cover and the ones that they cover up. And they regularly cover up things like the contradictions in the government's policies. For example, Gavin Williamson had a kind of dictatorial kind of policy imposed on against the Greenwich Council over the Greenwich Council's decision, which the council was forced to kind of withdraw, to close the schools on the safety grounds for the lockdown. Now, Liverpool City Council, whose mayor, elected mayor, Joe Anderson, was arrested a week ago. The Liverpool Council has now become the subject of an inquiry set up by the Secretary of State for Housing and Local Government, Robert Jenrick. Now, anyone who has watched this program before would know that we have extensively covered the lying and the corruption by Robert Jenrick over his dealings with Dirty Desmond, who's billion-pound, who is the porn billionaire, who is setting up a kind of housing degeneration structure in Tower Hamlets at a location called the West Ferry Road Print Works. That was where the print works were when Dirty Desmond was the owner of the Beaverbrook Daily Express and the Star Group. Now, Jenrick has now appointed a man called Max Collar. Collar like making a call, and Max is like Maximilian, maximum. Max Collar to head the investigation into the corruption allegations that have been made against the Liverpool City Council in the wake of that arrest of the elected mayor, Joe Anderson. Now, we have denounced this announcement. We alone have denounced this announcement. Not Keir Starmer, not an MP, not anybody else in this country. We have done the denouncing of Max Collar. And we have done that again factually, not because we have got an agenda against him, but we do have an agenda against corruption. And we do have an agenda against Max Collar being part of the corruption strategy that was operated in Tower Hamlets, because Collar was the second frontline person appointed by Robert Jenrick's predecessor at the time, Eric Pickles, in 2014 as a commissioner, allegedly to take over control of the Tower Hamlets Council, which never happened. And so today's circulation that we have seen today, that Robert Jenrick has appointed Max Collar to probe, that is, investigate the state of finance and the corruption in Liverpool City Council, is completely a corrupt move itself, because Max Collar and Ken Knight were two of the four commissioners that Eric Pickles had appointed in 2014. Now, Collar and Ken Knight were the two frontline or front-placed persons who openly colluded with Rachel Saunders and Peter Golds, two of the councillors on Tower Hamlets Council. Saunders, a Labour councillor, and Golds, a Conservative councillor. And at the end of the 3 years that Collar and Knight spent at the expense of the public in Tower Hamlets as so-called commissioners and investigators into Lutfur Rahman-controlled Tower Hamlets Council's corruption, Collar and Knight didn't produce any anti-corruption report or guidance or evidence. How do I know? Because I was in regular contact with them, asking questions, and they never answered questions. So I more than once confronted these two liars face to face in the Mulberry Place and called them liars in front of other people. And I gave them detailed accounts of their lying. Fleet Street is not talking about either Kola or night in Tower Hamlets. Fleet Street, as well as the local papers, the so-called Liverpool Echo and Liverpool News or whatever, they are kind of copying the line that Kola is an established professional investigator of councils. He is no such thing. And so therefore, what we shall be discussing at length in due course is the criminality of the so-called anti-corruption ministerial kind of commissioners. Now, when we refer to Ken Knight as a criminal, again, we said at the beginning of this edition, we don't use the word criminal because we don't know of another word that appropriately and suitably and sufficiently expresses his role. There is no such word other than criminal because he committed crimes. How did he commit crimes? Because he lied. When we submitted detailed reports about John Biggs, because by the time we had come into contact with them, Biggs was already in post and Lutfur Rahman had been ousted. Although they were there because of Eric Pickles' claim that Lutfur Rahman had been corrupt and they should investigate the corruption of Lutfur Rahman, they were still in place when I got in touch with them and contacted them. And at the beginning, they invited me to submit the information to them, which I did. And when I gave them the information, they refused or they failed to answer or acknowledge or reply or take action. And I kept doing that, and they kept doing what they were doing, which is to ignore and to lie to me, contrary to their initial promises and undertakings. So they left me no alternative but to face them face to face and call them liars, name them in front of other people, and they never disputed my calling them liars. To this day, I did that in 2016-17, and this is 2020. And those liars never challenged my description of them as liars and as crooks, nor has the liar Biggs. So this is the magnitude of the evidence. And when I say the evidence, I'm putting that in the context of the evidence of dysfunction by this government and this country, this state, locally as well as centrally and regionally. The BBC Panorama program that was broadcast in 2014 has been taken off the website and it's no longer available. And we have been waiting for the BBC to explain why. And there are other programs that have been taken off the internet after they were broadcast. For example, the one that Channel 4 television broadcast called Britain's Islamic Republic, which is what they call the Tower Hamlets. And that was broadcast in March. So April, May, June, July, August, September, October. There are 7 months before the actual so-called election to the elected mayor post. Now, it was all about Lutfur Rahman being prepared by a thing called Islamic Forum Europe, which is what was alleged in the program broadcast by Channel 4 on the dispatches, as a dispatches program. So that program made all kinds of allegations as to how the Islamic Forum Europe were preparing to install Lutfur Rahman as the mayor. Despite that clear evidence that at least one group was doing advanced planning to put a particularly named individual in the post of mayor, the Labour Party failed. And all the others who later turned out to be campaigning against corruption failed to stop that mayor election thing from going ahead. So Max Collar, Ken Knight would have been avoidable as double liars, lying about lying, kind of serial lying in Tower Hamlets. We shall be clarifying all of those in due course. So therefore, today's news from Liverpool that the crook Max Collar has been appointed to investigate Liverpool's alleged corruption under Joe Anderson is not consistent with the expectation that the people of Liverpool deserve and have to be told the truth. What Max Collar may have been selected for is nothing to do with Collar's record or Collar's interest in telling the truth. Collar's record is one of if you like, contemptible complicity with the corrupt regime. So Collar itself needs to be investigated. Why does Collar get called to investigate crooked council regimes when Collar himself is a crook and a liar? And why do some racists keep peddling the image of Collar as a reputable investigator of councils? He is not. And as we said before, not today, but earlier, in earlier editions, about the John Paulson and Reggie Maudling corruption in the 1970s, council corruption. As we have said about Robin Wales in Newham and his corrupt regime and his corrupt years, 16 corrupt years as the elected mayor in the name of the people of and the borough of Newham. As we have said about Steve Bullock, the lying racist crook at the expense of the people of Lewisham in South London. And as we have said about the racist criminal liar Ken Livingston Livingston, and we have said about the racist anti-Muslim liar Boris Johnson at the expense of the people of London. All these lying occupants in the post of mayor, either of the local boroughs or in the name of the whole of London, have been treated with impunity or have been given the license to behave with impunity from accountability. And that is not any basis for any Secretary of State, that is Cabinet Minister, which is Robert Chandrick is called, to make any claim that he's appointing a known crook like Max Kolla is the right thing to do against corruption, or a crooked regime in a crooked council, city council, as this particular item relates to. And again, there is no evidence. I mean, the whole reason I have gone all the way around those topics and personalities is because there is no investigative report in any of the Fleet Street papers about any of the crooked mayor or the crooked council. That is the fact. That is a fact. Now, exclusively we are saying this fact. Exclusively we have been saying that in the case of housing, because the corruption alleged against Liverpool Council and the Liverpool incumbent holder of the post of elected mayor, Joe Anderson, who has apparently decided to kind of remove the tension and the pressure against him following the reported arrest by stepping aside until the police confirm by the end of this month what they're going to do with him, because they arrested him after the investigation lasting for quite a while. Now, there is not going to be anything. As I said, I don't say because I am just thinking, sitting without any reference. I'm studying the evidence, and I've been studying the evidence 24/7 for decades. And that is my specialty. That is my main kind of field of work, investigating the evidence round the clock. And the evidence of the contents and the reason for the contents and the role of the contents of Fleet Street newspaper, so-called, is that it is the Fleet Street newspapers are run by and under the agenda of denial of the truth of the evidence. And the policy is perpetual about all corruption and criminality in councils. Anyone watching this is welcome to deny what I'm saying, but I require them to give me evidence substantiating any attempt to deny. And I'm saying that today's newspapers don't have anything about Liverpool corruption. They may have what is called the Press Association generated copy, repeated or edited to suit their house style, so-called, superficially referring to the events of Liverpool, but they're not talking in a dedicated way against the criminality done by Liverpool Council, elected mayor regime, or by the Croydon Council regime that was not necessarily done by the elected mayor, because the elected mayor has not been in place yet. But as we said earlier this week, the criminals in Croydon are going to laugh their heads off because their so-called critics want to make Croydon Council even more corrupt that the criminals have themselves made it. The so-called critics want to impose an elected mayor post on Croydon. And these critics, so-called, include members of the so-called Lib Dems party. The Lib Dems in Lewisham are doing the opposite. They are demanding the end to the elected mayor post in Lewisham. So where do you go? I mean, these people are running around idiotically, ignorantly, by refusing to tell the truth, refusing to confront the truth, and refusing to demand transparency from each of the councillors and each of the council regimes, whether it be the elected mayor fronted council regime or not. And what we are highlighting, what we are kind of exposing here, is that all of this is going on, but the Fleet Street papers are not covering this. They're covering this up. And there is no evidence that the so-called Daily Mail or the Beaverbrook Daily Express or the Murdoch Sun are interested in ending the corrupt regimes in any place, any borough, either in Tower Hamlets or in Liverpool or in Croydon. So anyone who is watching this but doesn't live in the UK or doesn't have the access to daily information about the UK and maybe of the view that the UK has got a very kind of honest society, needs to know this. It hasn't, and it doesn't. And if anyone believes that the British press tells the truth, can take it from us that it doesn't. Whatever the ideological kind of differences among viewers or among people looking at the evidence, the basic truth is that the British press, the newspapers, the media are vehicles for liars and for lying and for denying. Which is why in a population of say 60 million or whatever, the British population is about 60 million or 65 million, whatever the actual population, there are millions and millions of people living in low income or no income and in poverty and in hardship, individuals and families. To such an extent that the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, which has got an operation in the UK, has been compelled to get together some funds to distribute among the most poorest children that it can locate and access and reach. Remember what we have been saying? That Rishi Sunak is the finance minister of the cabinet fronted by Johnson, who has been extensively reported by the Private Eye, dated today, 18th of December 2020, as having hidden significant facts about his financial conflict of interest, to put it mildly. Sunak has been putting billions of pounds into the pocket of big business under the cover of the pandemic And yet, there are children going hungry in this country. And children going hungry was highlighted a few months ago by the footballer who supported the children to be fed during the months of the crisis. And Johnson refused to find the money. And today's news is that one of the nastiest politicians, who is a conservative MP and so-called kind of leader of the House, Jacob Rees-Mogg, instead of expressing regret for having failed, or his government having failed to feed the children, he has decided to condemn UNICEF for feeding the children, or feeding these particular numbers of children. And he has branded the UNICEF move as a political abuse of UNICEF's position. Words fail. There is no word to condemn Jacob Rees-Mogg. There is no word to condemn Boris Johnson for neglecting the hungry children and putting families and children in hunger. And in this criticism, the Financial Times is as much responsible and as guilty as the Guardian is, as the Daily Mirror is, because they have not been publishing the details, the facts, the evidence of how the actual policies of the government, financial policies, economic policies, so-called the tax policies, have been directly responsible for creating lack of income, lack of food, lack of basic income to individuals and families. I hasten to add one point. Although the newspapers and the media refer to families, the numbers of families are far smaller than the media portrays. There are at least 30% of the people in society are single. They are not living as families. They're living as single persons. So the reference should be not to families, but to persons in poverty, persons with children if there are single parents as well. The exclusion of single persons excludes and exacerbates and aggravates the problem that they face, and they are caused by government policy and the council policy and behavior. And the fact that Max Kolla and Ken Knight were lying in Tower Hamlets has got long-term ramifications, because the election commissioner that was appointed to consider the petition by the four persons who launched the petition against Lutfur Rahman's election, they launched the petition, filed the petition in June 2014, asking for the overturning of the election held on the 22nd of May 2014. When the election commissioner finally published his judgment on the 23rd of April 2015, he did that in a long kind of copy, long report. The judgment was quite long. And he referred to various things. but he did not refer to the history of Tower Hamlets Council in creating poverty. The history of Tower Hamlets Council having a corrupt history. The history of Tower Hamlets Council having a long list of crooks as councillors. So Richard Morey may have succeeded in looking at the kind of petitioner's claim against Lutfur Rahman. But he didn't actually recognize the rights of the electors and the community, which were denied and violated. And so therefore there was no room in Richard Morey's judgment to include the possibility that far more damage was being done by the Tower Hamlets Council than was defined by his judgment or referred to by him in his judgment. And those damages were done to initiatives, to projects, to ideas, to actions, to campaigns, defending the most valuable, most vital aspects of the community's, individuals, electors' rights, that no organization, no body, no elected councillor or elected MP was delivering or has been delivering or has been recognizing. So who did the delivering of these? It's the movement that the Khoodeelaar campaign is part of. And it is the extent, the fact and the extent and the evidence of the damage that both Lutfur Rahman did cause and his regime caused and his colluders caused, as well as John Biggs and others, that there is no scope, there is no kind of intellectual space available to even begin to measure those without taking into account international factors and international kind of dynamics and international kind events. By the magnitude, we refer to the role of the United Nations and the UNICEF, that kind of agencies. What we have been doing and what was targeted by the criminals with the collusion of Lutfur Rahman and his regime in Tower Hamlets Council constitutes work that is bigger in every sense, in terms of interpretation, in terms of advocacy, in terms of analysis, in terms of the evidence, than anything that UNICEF and other United Nations organizations, agencies relating to the UK could ever produce or match or equal. And because of the magnitude of the work and the magnitude of the impact and the implications, we are currently, the Khoodeelaar campaign and the movement defending the community in the East End of London, have been involved in examining the behavior of several UK government funded or government controlled or government founded agencies, including the role of the ministries that control the courts, that controls poverty and poverty creation, the ministry that controls the housing, and other agencies, including the Department for Business. So it's a huge undertaking that we have been having to carry out in order to form the basis for the investigation and the evidence of the outcome of the investigation, so that what we have found examines and relates to the behavior of the local councils, the behavior of the central government, the behavior of the likes of Ken Knight, Max Kolla, the London Fire Brigade, at least 30 individuals or firms, separate firms of the licensed law traders called solicitors, and at least 10 licensed law traders called barristers, and at least 30 members of several county courts and several high court judges, and at least 15 members of the tribunal service. Now, this is even before we refer to Roxana Fiaz, the current incumbent in the post of the elected mayor, at the expense of the people of Newham. And the impact of the damages caused include claims that have been made against the London boroughs of Newham, Tower Hamlets, and at least 5 agencies, including the Mayor of London. And none of these issues, which are central issues affecting central parts of life and living and the rights of people in society, can be found in the Fleet Street papers, nor in the contents of the BBC or Sky News, or of the counterparts on ITV and Channel 4 News, Channel 5 News. And none of the columnists on any of the papers, none of the opinion givers or opinion makers or opinion writers in any of the printed newspaper platforms or their counterparts on the BBC or Sky News or ITV has ever expressed any awareness of the possibility of any of the massive numbers of activities going on in society that we alone have been concerned about and focusing on and collecting evidence about. So all of these will be continued in the next edition. This is coming to 22:20 GMT in London. And we shall be focusing on the same theme,